I've been interested in violin since I was a very small kid. One of my very first memories as a young boy of about 4 or 5 is walking to the neighbor's house where I was going to go look at a violin. I didn't even know what I was going to look at, really. I didn't really have a concept, but I remember even then being thrilled with the idea that I was going to see and maybe get to hold a violin. If I could have done anything at all to avoid making a violin that looked different and still accomplish what I was trying to accomplish in terms of the ergonomics of the instrument, believe me, I would have done it. It was almost paralyzingly frightening that I was going to somehow put my name out there as a professional maker, bucking a tradition that was 500 years old. What I have developed is a series of instruments that look really unusual. They have often been compared to the work of Salvador Dali. I was the product of a very conservative training in a very fine and highly respected shop, where I was probably among the least impressive of the individual makers who were working there at the time. And I think had I been left entirely on my own, I would have continued to manufacture traditional instruments, probably run a fairly traditional repair shop, and do the things that most violin makers do. However, I was approached by a friend of mine who is a player who was in pain. She didn't have any permanent injuries yet, but she could see the handwriting on the wall that in another 5 or 10 years or so, the things that she was having to do orthopedically, the twists and odd positions she was having to put her body in order to play the viola, which was her instrument, were going to cause permanent damage eventually unless she did something about it. And she wrote to me and asked if there wasn't something I could do to help her. And that was how this whole project started. I did not start off with the first instrument and have exactly what I wanted. But I knew that there were certain kinds of things that I wanted to try to solve for violists. They have specific problems which are worse than anybody else's problems. Like a violinist, they play the instrument on the shoulder. They don't play it between their knees like a cellist. It's up here. And in order for them to play it that way, it requires that they do certain things with their left arm which are very unhealthy orthopedically. They have to twist their arms and hands very far over into this position.
It's an acoustical issue that we deal with, that the larger instruments tend to have a better violistic sound. They are closer to the perfection that the violin would have. The violin's body is perfect at 14 inches. The viola, to be perfect like a violin, would have to be 21 inches just because of the proportions. Nobody could play a viola up that's 21 inches, I don't believe, unless he was about 8 feet tall.
Every violist wants the smallest viola that they can easily, comfortably play, but that gives them the best sound. And everybody plays sort of the trade-off game. You either settle for a smaller viola and trade a little bit of the darker sound, mostly on the C string, that you're going to get, or you play a larger viola and you hurt.
I started having hand problems, probably actually, it might have even been my freshman year in high school, but I sort of had intermittent problems. They really, came in earnest when I was preparing for a big competition last September. I was really desperate when I could only play for about 10 or 15 minutes without having symptoms of pain in my arm starting. And so that's when we contacted David and borrowed a Pellegrina viola from him.
Is there a way to shrink the instrument mechanically and yet give it the size that it needs in order to have a good sound? So if you look at this instrument, the mechanics from the perspective of the hand, they're all on the right side of the instrument. And where the instrument is held on the person's shoulder is all on the left side of the instrument. So the mechanics of the instrument actually run across it at a diagonal from here to here. And if you look at this rather modernistic, surrealistic, Dali-esque shape here, you'll see that from the mechanics of the instrument, from the left side in the lower bouts, as they're called, to the right side in the upper bouts, it's quite short. And that is compensated for by taking it as if it were silly putty and then stretching it in the areas that don't interfere with the mechanics, so that when the player holds it, it's actually, the hand is pretty close in toward the body, a little bit more like a violin. And this is all tilted so that the range of motion of the elbow is much more comfortable for the player. And then the sound is compensated for by making this area quite long here.
It's not like when I picked it up and started playing it, it was like, oh, I can tell that the fingerboard is rotated this way, and this are the various things that he did to the instrument. But it was obvious in that I could play for 45 minutes or an hour without having any symptoms, and that was an immediate change. So that way, I could definitely tell dramatically that what the instrument was that the instrument was helping me.
Whether I'd still be playing at all, I think is a good question, because the elbow was just not getting better, and I was looking for smaller instruments, and it weren't helping. And I could just see my elbow getting worse and worse. I mean, physical therapy is wonderful. It has helped me many times. But I don't know that would have helped in my elbow. The tendonitis was just not getting fixed. It only got fixed with his viola.
There's no question that the Pellegrina and the ergonomic instruments that I have designed have made the difference in vocational life and death for several musicians. That's what drives me. I know I am helping people. I know that I'm making an impact in their lives. I just went and got the mail one day, a completely ordinary, normal event in my life, daily, and in it was a letter from the National Music Museum. The museum felt its role was not only to document those events of significant historic importance that took place in past times, but also those that were happening in our own time. And would I be willing to make an instrument for the museum? Probably the single most important element of a stringed instrument is its wood. This particular instrument is unusual in that it is not primarily going to be used to be played. It is going to be used to be looked at. And I decided based on that what I wanted to do was to use a tree that I knew was going to sound good, but the wood of which would also be really beautiful to look at. And that's what I did. Whenever I start working a piece of wood, I know that there are numerous kinds of things that I can end up with as variations when the thing is done. I start with a very set idea of the shape I want it to be, and also the kind of sound quality that I'm going to get out of it. That I'm pretty well set on. What it looks like can vary quite a bit. There is this sense of excitement. I know what I think this wood ought to look like based on my initial examination of it. I also know that it can change. Is it going to change for the better? Is it going to be the same? Is it going to be a disappointment? And there is an element of surprise that happens as I work the wood, as I get it closer and closer to its final shape, its final dimensions. And from time to time, the wood is even more beautiful than I thought it was going to be when I started with it. And those are moments of enormous satisfaction. As a violin maker, there are three basic areas that I am constantly concerned with. One is acoustics, one is mechanics. Those are the two most important. And then the third one, which is very important to me, is aesthetics. And I am constantly asking myself, what can I do to help these instruments sound better, to help the player feel better as the player is playing, to have these instruments look even more dramatic or more beautiful than they do now. I know how to achieve the curves that I want to achieve. I know where the wood has to stay and where I need to take it away. The real business of violin making is all in the refinements of the dimensions of the wood. That has to do both with shape and with thickness. The shape of the archings of the top and the back, and the thicknesses of the wood of both the top and the back and the ribs. Ribs are very important acoustically. If you leave too much wood in the ribs, the instrument will not sound good. If you take too much away, the instrument will collapse. Once the instrument belly or back, those two are called collectively the plates. Once the plates have been shaped, then the next thing that happens is you have to take wood out until the plate acts like a vibrating membrane. And that's a really sensitive time in the making, because if you leave too much wood in the instrument, it doesn't vibrate enough. And if you take too much wood out, the wood becomes so weak that it's too flabby. It doesn't have the tension it needs. And so this is a really sensitive time. There is a range of measurements, and it's not very wide. We are talking now in terms of tenths of millimeters, where it's critical to the sound of the instrument. As I sit there and take wood out of the instrument, I begin to tap the wood to listen for the pitch that the wood taps at, because it will have a very specific note. And then also the clarity with which I am hearing the tap. If it's kind of garbled, if it doesn't seem to be very distinct, then I know that something isn't quite right yet. And as I listen for that increased clarity, and I listen for that pitch to get closer and closer to the one that I am reasonably sure is going to be the one that sounds the best, that's what I'm listening for when I tap. F sharp. There's one part of the instrument that does not have to follow function. It can be a form of its own, and that is the very end of the scroll of an instrument, which is known as the volute. Well, in my very earliest experimentations in making Pellegrinas, tried to make a scroll with the spiral of Archimedes on the end of it. It just looked ludicrous. We came up with this shape, which I think is, well, it does several things. First of all, I think it's attractive. Second of all, I think it does very well match the sort of angled appearance of the rest of the instrument. But third, there is a satirical element to this, which I find very appealing. Almost the very first thing I do when I make it is I take it on the drill press and I drill a hole right through the middle of the scroll, so it creates this hole that is coming right through the middle of the volute. The fact that this could have humor in it and still be attractive gives me a great deal of pleasure, because whenever somebody, a violin maker, picks up one of my scrolls who has never seen one of my instruments before, there's always this terrific double take that they look at this and then it shorts out all of their circuits because they are expecting to see something and they don't see what they think they're going to see. And I like that. I want them to think outside of their box. I want this instrument to be something that forces people to look at something that can be beautiful, but look at it in a completely different way than they ever have before. If you go to the very earliest history of the violin, and even before the violin, makers were very, very creative in what they did up here. There were heads of people, like a bowsprit on a ship, figureheads. There were all kinds of designs. There were fantastical shapes that makers just allowed their imaginations to run wild, because this really is the signature of the maker. I use everything I know when I make an instrument. Everything I know about the craft comes into play as experience that I've had before that I am going to call on to manifest certain parts of the instrument. But then there's this other little thing that kicks in from time to time that says, hey, how about this direction? Or how about trying such and such? And that's what makes it exciting. That's what makes it fresh every day, every time I make an instrument. One of the most exciting moments in any instrument that I make is when I first begin the actual cutting of it. When I make those first cuts, my thoughts are usually on the person who is going to receive the instrument. That may be the moment when the connection is the strongest. It's almost as if I go into my head and I say, I conjure up the image of this person and I say, okay, my attention is on you now. And that's an important moment.
I think there are things that bring particular makers and particular players together, you know, and similar goals and agendas, you know. And when David and I met, it was pretty clear that this was a good combination because he was looking to do something, totally outside of the box. And if you're sort of going in that direction yourself and you're trying to discover new sounds and new ways of playing an instrument that's essentially, hundreds of years old, and you got somebody who's willing to build one and go, I know about all those traditions, but I don't really care about them because I want to do something that's going to serve your purpose, whatever that is. Tell me what you need out of the instrument. And I explained exactly what I wanted to him, and he was, 3 months later, delivered it to me, which was just remarkable.
Someone may approach me and say, what I really want is this kind of gravelly jazz, honky sound to the instrument, and what can we do to produce something that sounds like that, or something that sounds like a jazz harmonica?
So this is the axe, the Riviola that David made, and the thing that struck me at first, besides just that it's a gorgeous instrument and how well made it is, just in terms of violin making, it's just ingenious how he overcame several problems, playing problems. And a 6-string instrument is not easy to play. It's much more difficult than a 4-string. Because of the arc of the bridge, the added arc of the bridge to be able to hit 6 strings without hitting 2 strings at a time, he had to remove one of these pointy corners here in order so that you don't hit it with your thumb. The center line of the instrument doesn't line up with where the neck is. It's off center, which allows you to get around this bout more easily and still preserves the volume of a viola. And then of course the headstock, the peg box, is pretty remarkable. Just really well crafted, and it seems to be singing. It's not just a new violin, another violin. Having a new instrument that nobody's ever seen before and nobody's ever had before. It's the only one of its kind in the world. What it does is it makes you create new music. You think you come up with ideas you wouldn't have if you were playing a different instrument.
What a traditional concert violist may want may well be something entirely different than what someone else who is in the field of composition, let's say, who's looking for a new sound, who wants something radically changed. That's different than from what a jazz musician might want. We tend to think of the violin as this sacrosanct shape that was somehow descended from heaven, and that it can't be touched, and that it can't be manipulated, and that it cannot be improved upon. And if one goes back and studies the history, the earliest history of the violin, one comes away with a very different concept of how it came to being, which was, it was a response to a public demand for a new style of art making, which required a whole new style of technology. And that is exactly how the violin came into being.
When Strad was working on his instruments, I'm sure he had fiddle players in his shop playing them, and they played in an Italian Baroque style. And they would try something, Vivaldi, Corelli licks, and that's what this instrument was designed to play.
As an innovator, I guess you'd have to say I'm really conservative. Basically, I'm still making violins out of wood in the most traditional fashion. I have made them easier to play. I have changed the sound a little bit, and for some of my customers a great deal because they have requested that. I have begun to use different materials.
You get that great energy from him where you feel like, wow, I've just been passed this torch. Now what do I do? Or the baton. Wow, and I got to start running. And it's just, he's like, here, go, man. Take this thing and figure out what to do with it. It's a very inspiring, place to be. I think I would much rather have somebody drop something like that into my lap rather than, maybe even more so than a Strad. I don't know.
I think everybody who does anything at all creative needs more than one set of eyes, and in my case, being a violin maker, ears. And the person I rely on more than any other in my life is my wife, Patty. Let's say I have been working on this particular aesthetic concept for days, maybe even weeks. And it's so fixed in my head. All of my thoughts have been going in the direction of trying to answer the question, how do I manifest this thing? And so I come with the first prototype and I show it to Patty. Now she is completely uninvested in what I have been doing, whereas I have invested hours upon hours in this. And so the first thing she wants to do is be objective. So often what follows are these very amusing, in retrospect, conversations where she is critiquing what I have done and I'm defending it like crazy. At the same time, as this little voice is going in the back of my head, she's right, she's absolutely right. And she'll finally say, okay, fine, do what you want to do, and I'll walk away, and an hour later, I will come back with the revisions made exactly as she had suggested, and both of us feel a lot happier about it, because it's better. This particular instrument is unusual in that it is going to be used primarily to be looked at. I decided that I was going to emphasize those aspects that are visual as much as auditory. And one of the things that I do for a lot of my clients is to do some kind of decorative purfling inlay. Purfling is this very thin strip of 3 pieces of veneer, which has been squashed a little bit to fit into a tiny groove cut into the surface of the instrument. I decided that in the instrument that I was going to make for the museum, I was going to do something very special. I spent quite a bit of time designing an artistic outlay that involves special purfling and also a couple of paintings. If it's going to be something seen in a museum, then that is something that I think will have special appeal. There's very little about violin making that I don't like. I really would have a hard time. What's more thrilling, doing purfling or making a scroll? What's more exhilarating, getting the tap tone just right or cutting a beautiful F hole? Yeah, I can't make those choices. I find it all truly engrossing. The only time I don't like it is when I'm tired. And then I know I have to go take a nap. After that, I like it again. Decorative paintings on violins go go back all the way to the origins of the violin itself, because the original patrons for violins tended to be not only musicians, but musicians working in courts, for the aristocracy, for the nobility. And very often the musicians themselves couldn't afford the instruments. It was the king or the duke or the count who would buy these instruments to have as his own and then loan them out essentially to his court musicians. The patron for this particular instrument is the National Music Museum in South Dakota. And this is an important enough instrument that I would like to do something to recognize the participation of this museum, to decorate the instrument, to make it a little bit special visually, because it's going to be an instrument that is largely looked at. And so I did a little research, and the state flower of South Dakota is something called the pasque flower. And that's what I have done in homage to the museum, which is in South Dakota, in homage to the region, which is going to become an increasingly important center for musical instruments. There is this moment when that brush first goes on that wood where it almost takes your breath away as you realize where this color is going to go and how dramatic it's going to look when it finally gets there. And that is a thrilling moment. Even after 33, 34 years in this business, I still feel that. If we see an instrument across the room, the first thing we're going to see is color. When the great masters in Cremona, Stradivarius, Guarnerius, when they made instruments and they varnished them, they used brilliant oranges and reds, with the result that many of those instruments were, when they were new, as gaudy looking as an Andy Warhol painting. What has happened over a long period of time is that these instruments have worn, and their varnishes are no longer as vibrant as that. It's been my generation of violin makers that has been successful in going back and recreating those kinds of varnishes. We are using more or less the same materials that were used by the Cremonese makers in the 17th and 18th centuries. And we have also learned to reuse those pigments. And so we can now make our instruments look as brilliant and as fiery and as vibrant as those makers first made their instruments look. My instruments stand out. And they don't stand out so much because of their shape, but because of this fiery orange-red color that was on all of the very first ones that I made, until I began to realize that I had to modify my varnish color and subdue it a little bit. So now I am much more philosophical. I have players who want to hide, and I assist them in hiding, and they get all the dark brown varnishes, and so they don't have to stand out any more than the shape of the instrument makes them stand out under any circumstances. But then I do have customers who come along. I had one, I almost got down on my knees and kissed his feet. He said, "I want a passionate color." And it was like fresh air to me. I felt for the first time, what else can I do to help this guy? I want to make him a violin so much. And so he got a passionate color, which is actually a very traditional and very historic color. I would have a hard time separating craft from art in a violin. It's all about craft. There's not anything that goes into the making of an instrument that has not been crafted. And most of it, certainly the most important aspects of it, all crafted by hand, by an individual using a sharp tool. That is a craft. And yet, the whole time that that is going on, there is a concept in the maker's mind about the direction that the maker is going, the direction that he or she wants to pursue in order to come to a certain goal, a certain end. And that's all about an artistic concept. That's all about a shape, a design, an aesthetic, a color, a varnish, and of course the acoustic aspects of the instrument, what it's going to sound like. And that's very much on the maker's mind. It's very much on my mind as I make the instrument. But could I say, well, that's art and the rest of it's craft? No, it's achieved. The art is achieved through the craft. One is the means, one is the end. There was an Italian immigrant who was a violin maker whose name was Alfio Batelli. I never met him, but I heard stories about him because he was apparently quite a character. And one of the things that Alfio would do when a really beautifully decorated instrument would come into his shop, he would look at it admiringly, go over every aspect of it where the maker had done all kinds of special things to it. And then he would shake his head and he'd say, why he waste days of time? And I always think of Alfio whenever I do these kinds of elaborate things to violas. And there's a part of me that agrees with Alfio that this is enormously time consuming. And yet what you get when you're done is so terrific that I really enjoy the process of the creativity, the artwork that goes into it before it even starts to manifest on the instrument. And then the result, which is always so beautiful.
The original collection that is the basis of the museum was developed by my father, who's a product of the Midwest. As the museum evolved, it's now, we can say quite frankly, the leading musical instrument museum in the world. By far the largest in number, but also the most inclusive collections anywhere in the world. A lot of this is not the instruments so much as it is the story. Who played it or where was it used? Because we want to document more than just the instrument as a physical object, but also the context, musical, cultural, and so forth, of which it originally was a part.
One of the things that's fascinating about musical instruments as cultural objects is that they are part of their time and their own place in history. I love to research and uncover more details about makers that were alive a long time ago and get to know them a little more as people. But that's also something that makes it exciting to work with modern makers too. And I'm just thrilled when modern makers come here to study the instruments, because it does remind me that there are people alive who are making instruments, and they're building this connection with the past and being influenced by the past, but taking their own direction.
Well, the history of violin making is one that was dominated essentially in European circles by the guild system, which was apprenticeship and then continuation of the same traditions. But the violin making tradition stayed the same longer than did band instruments or that sort of thing, because they were much more easily made in a factory type situation where the hand craftsmanship was not as important anymore.
There's something so extraordinarily beautiful, both acoustically and visually, with the violin. And the tradition is so long now. There is one thing that I have going for me that many of my predecessors who also tried to change things did not have going for them. And that is the whole issue of ergonomics, which is a very new science in the relative length of history of the violin. Players are getting injured. Players are being forced to play an amount that is orthopedically unhealthy. And if I have anything on my side now that might make me succeed where others have not succeeded before me, it is this issue that I am not trying to make change for the sake of change. I am trying to make change for the sake of the health of the player.
We have a very good collection of experimental instruments from different time periods, all the way through the 19th century and into the 20th century. What's interesting about a lot of them is that they simply weren't adopted by musicians. They may have been good ideas, they just didn't really catch. And what seemed different to me about the Pellegrina is maybe it actually was visibly more radical than a lot of the other experimental things, but players were adopting it. And there was a real reason why they were adopting it. Basically, it solved a problem that players had. Instead of trying to impose a new sound or a new look on musicians who didn't really need it.
The word I use, and maybe it doesn't translate very well, is this incredible presence it has. I mean, it's just right there, grabbing you, whereas another instrument might, I mean, oh yeah, that sounds nice.
There are makers who on a subtle level might be doing something like copying Stradivari or copying Bergonzi or taking little bits from this maker or that maker. Or you have people like David who are being influenced by not just violin making, but 20th century art.
It's just a unique combination of characteristics of this individual person who had both the talent and the training to do wonderful woodworking and the imagination to meet a need that he identified and thought he could do something about.
People have tried and tried to copy Stradivarius. They copy him, at least visually, all the time. I know that I can't. I'm not good enough, and I will never make an instrument that sounds like a Stradivarius. At least I can emulate that part of him that said, keep pursuing the ideal. Even though you will never reach it, don't ever give up on the ideal. To try to achieve something that is relevant to my time. On behalf of my late father, Edward Rivinus, and my mother, who is very much alive but couldn't be here today, Esther Rivinus, they would like to give the gift of this viola to the National Music Museum, and on behalf of them, I present it to you with enormous enthusiasm and equal gratitude for what you and your staff here at the National Music Museum are doing on behalf of musical instruments all over the world. We are at a crossroads now, an historic crossroads, where we're standing on a balance point. We have now rediscovered the secrets that were lost for 2 centuries to us as violin makers. So the question is, what do we do next? Do we continue to then just make all these reproductions of instruments that were made in the 18th century? Or do we use this knowledge in the same way that it has been used in other fields of musical craft, in the woodwinds, in the brass, in the percussion sections, with pianos? Do we now too evolve as a craft and take it in new directions? Take it in ways that will solve problems that people in our craft have not even begun to consider solving.